Okay, hello. Welcome back. 1,800 years of history now. You ready for it? All right, here we go. Now, let's check in on where we left off by going to the map. So when we left off, the Western world was really sort of the Greek world, from Greece up through the Balkans, all the way over to like Afghanistan and India, down here, all down here, Egypt. This whole territory right here was sort of the Greek world. After Alexander died, it was broken up into different kingdoms that were ruled by his generals, or in the case of Seleucid, Seleucid was the assassin of the general in that area, got it as a reward. And now, this state of affairs lasted for about 200 years. And then, at the 200-year marker, thereabouts, is when you finally get the Roman Empire incurring in from the west and the Parthians coming in from the east, and they both conquered throughout until about this area here. So that's what that looked like. All right, now something to understand about this period of time and the time that came after it was just how much this whole world, this whole area was a Greek culture. So Greek culture really permeated the lands in this whole area. This is called the Hellenistic age. The Greeks call themselves the Hellenes, so that means this is sort of the Greek-ish age. In these areas, the ruling class were Greek. They all spoke Greek. Most of the business was done in Greek. Even in a place like Armenia, the Armenians would go do business in Greek and then go home and speak Armenian. So there was Greek culture throughout there. I heard someone once describe Greek culture in this whole area now is like how much you see American culture everywhere with McDonald's or Coke or gym shoes or whatever. Throughout. That's what the whole world was like. And even after the Romans and Parthians came in and conquered their own areas of it, it was still a Greek world. They were just ruling it. Hundreds of years later, when the Roman Empire split into the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire switched its official language from Latin to Greek. And so there you had, it was still Greek, even after the Roman Empire was there for hundreds of years. So that is something to remember. One of the things that I have as a touchstone is how prevalent Greek culture was at that time is the impact that the Greek culture had on the developing Christian church. So I am a Christian, and it always strikes me that the word we use to describe ourselves, Christian, Christ, is a Greek word. That is, if I were to jump in a time machine and go back and meet Jesus and say, hey, I'm a Christian, he would say, you're a what now? We describe ourselves as a follower of a person using a word that person wouldn't even have known. And that is just the tip of the iceberg as to the impact of the Greek culture and Neoplatonism on the early Christian church. But I'm not going to go down that route, not going to go down that tangent. Talk about it a little bit later, but that's just, for me, like I said, a touchstone of how dominant the Greek culture was in all those lands that you just saw on the previous map. All right. Now, people see the Greek-Roman hybrid world there as sort of the foundation of Western civilization. And they each contributed something different. You know, this whole Greece thing contributed the philosophy and the mathematics and the stuff we've been talking about all up until now. The Romans contributed as well, but what the Roman culture contributed to Western civilization is sort of the notion of ambition and militarism and patriarchy, more engineering rather than science, was sort of the Roman end of things. And so the Romans didn't really contribute a lot to this narrative that we're developing so far of like what is the nature of mathematical objects. They didn't really care that much about that as long as they could build the things. This was definitely an era of if it works, and good enough is good enough. The Romans really valued Greek learning, but they valued it as sort of a sign of culture. All the aristocratic class would learn Greek philosophy and stuff in school, but not really in depth, not really rigorous, just enough to have an interesting cocktail party conversation over it. You might have heard of big Roman baths, a big social setting. And the baths usually weren't just the baths where people went and bathed. They were like this huge complex where you could go and you could work out, you could probably get something to eat. And among other things they'd have is sort of reading libraries that after you go work out and then take your bath and then relax in this library reading some, light readings, just going over in a popular way, Greek teaching and philosophy. So the Romans' grasp of Greek philosophy was pretty much on the level of these videos here. That is not to say at all that these videos are anything great, but let's just say that if these videos were the yardstick by which, say, rigor and thoroughness were judged in the history and philosophy of mathematics, then the state of the history of philosophy and mathematics nowadays would be in real trouble. Now, unfortunately, that was the state of Greek learning in the Roman world, and that is the Greek heritage that the Romans bequeathed to medieval Europe. And so they had to get their good stuff from somewhere else. That's setting up what's going to come up later. Okay, so now, like I said earlier, the Roman Empire became so big that it had to divide itself into two, the Eastern and Western empires, and that the Eastern Empire, after it broke off, became Greek-speaking. The Western Empire collapsed in about the 5th century AD. Now, the usual story of its collapse is that corruption and internal military conflict weakened the military so that external German barbarians were able to raid in and invade and just pillage and conquer the whole area. And that's not exactly what happened. The corruption and the weakening of the military is what happened, but a lot of the Germans were already there. Here, let's go take a look at this on a map. Whoops. All right, let's get rid of this. Whoops, and then get another layer going here. And so let's see, the Western, let's say red for Roman. The Western Roman Empire was pretty much Italy and then like France and Spain, not Germany, not Austria. So that was the area. They had borders here and borders here along the Danube and along the Rhine River. And these areas over here were sort of the Germanic areas. Now, the Romans managed the Germans in two ways. First, for those Germans, the blue area I squiggled on, they were able to kind of divide and conquer. They could play one tribe off against another to keep them divided and weak. But on the other hand, they would let German tribes come into their area and settle down where they told them to, as long as those tribes would contribute fighters to the Roman legions. Rome has classically always had difficulty paying for its army. That has been an ongoing theme throughout the Roman Empire. And the way they had to come up to get a good army going now is that in exchange for some land to settle on and colonize, those Germanic peoples needed to contribute a legion to the Western Roman Empire. And by the time of what we were calling the fall of the Roman Empire, most of those legions were Germanic peoples. Now, there was the corruption, there were some civil wars going on, that all imploded. And when that happened, the Germans were already there. And their fighters were the Roman legions. They just decided to go into business themselves. They didn't invade, they just decided to stop listening to Rome. Sometimes this meant a Germanic tribe elder or whatever it was at the time declaring himself a king and carving out a country for himself. Or sometimes it meant saying, we really don't like this area, we're going to pick up and move somewhere else and find some better land, and then carving out their kingdom in another area as well. Now, this is important to understand because it's these sort of Romanized Germanic peoples that understood the Roman culture and the idea of imperial authority that settled in, wanted to replicate the might of the Roman Empire. That's what eventually evolved into the European nations as we think of them today. So there we go. And also, so that was sort of the fall of the Roman Empire there, with the Germanic peoples being replaced by Germanic kingdoms. And then in the east, I don't know what color to use. Is that purple? And then in the east, I said that this area here was the Parthian Empire. Romans came in from the west, Parthians came in from the east. Well, then another group called the Sasanians came out. They revolted against the Parthians and kind of took over this area. And so this became the Sasanian Empire. The difference being the Parthians were a steppe people who saw themselves as the inheritors of a Greek empire, and they were followers of an Alexander the Great. The Parthians saw themselves as the inheritors of the Persian Empire, and they were sort of the new Persians. And the importance there is this led to, well, and of course I should mention we still have an Eastern Roman Empire. So right over here in this area, well actually this whole area here is kind of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire, Sasanian Empire, fought back and forth a lot and fought themselves really into ruin, really ruined themselves. So that in 600 AD, out comes Muhammad out of Arabia here with the Muslim armies, and they have just a big conquest fest. They are able to start conquering all these lands through here. They go all the way out into the sort of Indian Greco lands I talked so much about before, but at this time those lands were run mostly by other steppe peoples. They covered all of North Africa here and eventually up into Spain. And so this is the extent of what was called the Dar al-Islam, which means the world of Islam. Okay, and that's like, well, of course, all over Arabia. Whoa, Arabia here, and Egypt and Northern Africa, and all the way up to Spain. So, oh, this is getting messy. And it was messy. So here's the Dar al-Islam. Now's a good point, but I want to talk about the Library of Alexandria, because one of the stories is that coming through, it was the Muslim conquerors that burned down the Library of Alexandria. Did that happen? Maybe. Well, let me tell you. The Library of Alexandria is probably the ancient wonder of the world, or classical wonder of the world, that was destroyed the most times in history. And I don't just mean that, oh, it was destroyed and then rebuilt. I mean, nope, this was the end of it. Bam. It was finished in the Roman Civil War when it was Antony and Cleopatra versus Octavian. It was finished when Justinian the Just, a Christian Roman emperor, shut down all of the institutes of pagan learning. It was finished when the Muslims got there and burned all the books in it. This kind of reminds me, I'm a father, and it kind of reminds me as if I hear a crash in the other room and go out there and I see my son standing over a broken lamp and say, what happened here? And he said, oh, my sister did it, or the cat did it, or the wind blew into the window and blew it over, or did you feel that earthquake just now? The more explanations he gives me, the less likely I am to believe each one. And there are lots of explanations as to how the Library of Alexandria was eventually destroyed. So what do I think is going on? Here's my take. A lot of historians have tried to explain what caused the end of Greek learning, this big era of Greek learning. And for each explanation, nothing would serve as a better sort of final concrete capstone to their explanation than to explain how that led to the destroying of Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria. So, you know, if you wanted to argue it was the pagan Romans that ended Greek learning, you're going to talk about the Civil War with Antony and Cleopatra and Octavian. If you want to talk about how it was the Christian Romans that ended Greek learning, you're going to talk about Justinian the Just. If you want to talk about how it was the Muslim invasion that ended Greek learning, you're going to talk about the sack of Alexandria when the Muslims came through. So I don't know that we really have any good reason to believe any one of those explanations over any other. But what we can say is that there was some point in time when the preeminent institution of Greek learning was in Alexandria. It was thriving, and the body of Alexander the Great was kept in state in the mausoleum there, and we had all that. And then at some other point in time, those things were gone. I mean, Alexandria was still a good big city, but it wasn't that anymore. And how that happened is still an open question in history. All right, so where did we leave off? Okay, now let's go back to Europe. Let's go back to our map. Now would be a great time for yet another layer. All right, So I just said that it was these sort of Romanized German peoples with this idea of what empire was and empire means and so forth that settled the countries of Europe eventually. Now, in 800, a Frankish king by the name of Charlemagne did a lot. Charlemagne went through and conquered a lot of territory here. He basically conquered all of what you consider France and Germany and Italy, or northern Italy. The southern was still Lombardy, held by the Lombards and so forth. So he conquered that whole area there. And Pope Leo III crowned him the new Roman emperor of this territory. Not Spain, because this was at the time when that was under Muslim rulership. He did fight in Spain against the Muslims. That did not go well for him. If you've ever read the Song of Roland, it's a noble, spectacular defeat is what that song is celebrating. And Charlemagne's idea, his image of his empire, bears very strong resemblance to our image of medieval Europe right now. Among other things, he thought there should be a church in every town. That, first of all, it was all Christian. It all had to be Christian. And when he conquered these areas, not all the areas he conquered were Christian yet, but everything was Christian. There was a church in every town. There was a priest in every church, and that priest had some education and was able to bring that education to his people. He said once of the priests in his area that their theology was divine, but their grammar was diabolic. And so they needed an education. And so he declared this. And that created a huge boom for a need for universities throughout Europe. So all of these institutions of learning were suddenly in high demand. Now, they were in high demand. And as I had said earlier, the heritage of Greek learning that I don't think I need this map right now. The heritage of Greek learning that Rome had passed down to them was kind of a popular works, just to get you a good idea, not really rigorous. And so these new areas of learning really needed more rigorous curriculum material to teach. So where did they get it from? Well, two places. First of all, despite the fact that the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire, which not only maintained all of this Greek learning, but was Greek speaking itself, was still in business. And so you get stuff from there. And secondly, by this point in time, the Muslims definitely had discovered all this Greek learning and fell in love with it, spread it all over, were reading it, sharing it, all of that stuff, translating it. And so if you remember at the time, Spain was Muslim. So in Spain, a lot of Jews in Spain, or Muslims there as well, could translate these works into Latin and then sell them across the border over into France and the rest of Europe. And so they could get new Greek learning in that way. Now, remember, these are Christian institutions set up in order to train your parish priest. And if you think that flooding them with pagan Greek curriculum is seen through a Muslim lens would cause tension or maybe even conflict in these schools set up to train your town priest, you would be right. There was a huge conflict and debate over it. Now, earlier, I really emphasized the strong impact that Neoplatonism had on the early Christian church. Unfortunately, that didn't mitigate the conflict as much as you might think. First of all, and the Christians themselves didn't really appreciate this, Neoplatonism wasn't Platonism. I'm not going to get into the distinction there, but the only work of Plato that survived into Europe in the Middle Ages from Rome was, I think, the Timaeus. So that's one thing. And if you go to a bookstore today, you could find the works of Plato and the Republic, a big book, and all these dialogues and all this stuff. All of those other things came onto the scene at this time, and even the stuff from Plato might prove a challenge to the Neoplatonism that the church had at the time. But it gets better. People kind of forgot about Aristotle until then. And so at this time is when all of this Aristotelian stuff came in. And let me tell you, the Muslim philosophers, the Islamic philosophers were crazy about Aristotle. They loved him. And so they got a lot of Aristotle. And if you recall, back when I showed you like the painting of the School of Alexandria by Raphael, the center of it was Plato and Aristotle engaged in a huge argument and debate. So all of this Aristotelian stuff flooding in also didn't necessarily ease the culture shock that these Christian universities were getting in seeing this. Some people in the universities loved the stuff and they just thought it was the greatest. Some people hated it. They thought it was heretical. Eventually, in the 12th century, a guy by the name of Thomas Aquinas created a huge synthesis of Aristotelian Greek thought through this Islamic lens, the lens of Islamic philosophy, merged with the Christian teaching at the time to create this large synthesis. It was very controversial when he did it. At first, it was banned as heretical, but then it was later adopted. The changes came just from political changes amongst people who liked him versus people who didn't. And then eventually it became basically the cornerstone of theology and philosophy of what today we call the Roman Catholic Church. So that eventually became the cornerstone of that. All right. Now, where are we? Oh, and this new perspective that Aquinas introduced that became the big thing is historically called scholasticism. And scholasticism basically became the thing of the church. This is what the Enlightenment philosophers in a few hundred years are sort of struggling against, bouncing up against at the time. Okay, so now in the scholasticism, what's the relationship between religious theology and rational philosophy, the precursor of what we call science? So the scholastics believed that God could do miracles, but that he usually didn't. And so if you wanted to explain, like, why does it rain, you would have to come up with a rational, what we would call scientific explanation of why it usually rained. Sure, God could make it rain or stop raining, but that's not what usually happened. And so to just explain rain by saying God wills it was inadequate. You know, you had to come up with a better explanation than that. Now, the church universities then became the center of learning throughout Europe. All right. Now, it's said that the church basically had this sort of dogmatic stance on the truth. This scholastic teaching, Aristotle and so forth, was the truth, and you could not disagree with it. No one could argue it or debate it. It's just what is, and that's not exactly right. You could disagree with Aristotle, let's say, or any of those Greeks, and argue against them in the right circumstances, under the right conditions. And one condition is that you had a good argument. You know, they really did have a sense of rigor. They really did teach their students critical thinking and how to debate and argue. And if you had a good argument, then that would be considered. And the second thing is that you had a PhD. Although the church didn't want to say that this is what's true, this is always what's true, and no one can question it, the university system did want to have an institutional monopoly on who could or couldn't question or interpret the Greeks. And this started to cause an internal tension in the church itself among, say, the academic institutions and the Pope. You know, the academic institutions might tell the uneducated Pope, hey, don't worry your little popey head about things. We'll tell you what's right or wrong or true or false because we're the educated ones. And the Pope really didn't appreciate getting condescended to by a bunch of ivory tower elitists. You know, you could respond, hey, I'm the Pope. So there is a tension there. And I think that tension is important to know, to understand what's going to happen next in the next lecture on Copernicus and Galileo. All right, so in about the 1300s, what happened was more people had access to these Greek works now and wealth and leisure time in order to study them. And this created a bit of a rebellion against the university's institutional monopoly on interpreting the Greek writing. So this isn't the Protestant Reformation. This is sort of more of a academic rebellion against the institutional monopoly when it comes to interpreting Greek. And that's the people who were in this camp are called the humanists. So it was the beginning of what's called the humanist rebellion against the church's monopoly on learning. And this is not exactly right and probably isn't entirely fair, but one might say, or at least get the right idea if they said that no real big innovation or new thinking came out of the university system between Aquinas, who was in the 1100s, and say Kant, who was in the 1780s. Over that time, the big innovations came from like Descartes was a mercenary going around fighting wars in Europe. Newton did a bunch of things, among which was he was the master of the mint in England. Hume was a diplomat. And it wasn't until Kant in like the 1780s, late 18th century, that a university professor stepped up and really entered into our story again. So our next lecture, whoops, that's it, 1800 years. Okay, our next lecture is going to slow down again, and we're going to take a look at the leading edge of what I call this humanist revolution with Copernicus and then Galileo, because that's going to establish the intellectual environment in Europe for this next wave of thought coming in which those issues that we left off in the last video that the Greeks left us with will be taken up again and struggled with. Not necessarily in the Copernican Galileo part in the next lecture, but after that, when I talk about Descartes and Newton, they're going to pick up some of these things and see what they can do with it. So, all right, hope to see you then.